What a beautiful day. A clear sky and no waves, a steady breeze. Perfect day to be out on the water, except if you have engine trouble. You know, I don't know a boat owner who hasn't had engine trouble from time to time. Unfortunately, the time is usually on days just like today, or when you've had just a perfect day that nothing could spoil, and then there you are, all alone, no mechanic in sight. And if you're lucky enough to find a mechanic, you can bet he's probably on overtime. You know, problems are always going to occur, but by knowing the intricacies of your marine engine, you can learn to do routine maintenance and troubleshooting yourself. By knowing how to do this yourself, you can keep your maintenance costs down, you can reduce your chance of problems. You know, it's better than an insurance policy. This tape is designed to give you some control over your own seafaring destiny. You will see that the mystery of engine maintenance is really no mystery at all. As a matter of fact, it's quite simple. All it is understanding why certain things occur and knowing where to start. Sometimes it's the most simple things that will keep you stuck here at dockside instead of out there having fun. Let's start by taking a general look at the engine itself. In this program, we'll be discussing 8-cylinder engines. However, the same principles used for a V8 can be used on any inboard engine. The motor here is very similar to the motor in your car. In fact, many marine engines are only modified car engines. Inboards are water-cooled and operate on a 4-stroke cycle, just like your car. The only difference is the adaptation of a marine transmission. There's also a different cooling and exhaust system. For the overview, let's go into the boathouse and take a look at an engine. For description purposes, we'll use a working model of an engine. This is the cylinder block. Inside this block is where most of the major action takes place. These 8 bores are the cylinders. Your engine may have less, but this one has 8. Inside each cylinder is a piston. The piston fits tightly in the cylinder and moves up and down as the engine runs. It's actually the part that does the work. The purpose of the pistons is basically to pull the gas mixture into the cylinders, push the exhaust fumes out, and help turn the engine. At the top of each cylinder, we have 2 poppet valves. This one is the intake valve, and this one is the exhaust valve. The intake valve allows combustible mixture into the cylinder. After the mixture is burned, the exhaust valve then opens to let the gases escape. It's like breathing through your mouth and exhaling through your nose. The fuel is mixed in the carburetor. Gasoline fumes and air are combined and then sucked into the cylinder through the intake valve. Also on the carburetor is the choke. Now, this is both a blessing and a curse. The choke lets in air only when it's open. Most engines have an automatic choke controlled by a choke thermostat. They only work when the engine is cold. A manual choke can be used anytime. What the choke does is help the engine start when it is cold by allowing more gasoline and less air than usual into the carburetor. As the engine warms up, the choke gradually opens, normalizing the fuel-air mixture. However, closing the choke at times other than when the engine is cold can cause the engine to flood. The gasoline is transferred from the gas tanks to the carburetor by the fuel pump. Once the intake valve allows the gasoline-air mixture into a cylinder, it is ignited by a spark. That electric spark is controlled and regulated here in the distributor. The distributor basically has 2 functions. It controls which spark plug will receive electricity and at what time the spark will occur. After the mixture is burned by the spark from the spark plug, the exhaust valve opens up to let the spent gases escape into the exhaust manifold. From there, the fumes travel to the exhaust pipe and out into the water. The cooling system of your boat is slightly different than that of a car. Cooling water is circulated around the engine by the water pump. The amount of water allowed to circulate is controlled by a thermostat which causes more cooling water to pass through the system as the engine heats up. As the water is circulating around the engine, it passes through a series of pipes, tubes, and passages as it cools the entire engine. The cooling water then transfers to a heat exchanger that acts like the radiator in your car, which transfers the heat to seawater circulating through it. The heated seawater is then dumped back overboard through the exhaust. A good lubricating system is essential to any motor. It's extremely crucial to the marine motor because it's worked far beyond its land-loving cousin. The lubricating oil is held in the oil pan at the bottom of the crankcase. The oil is sucked up from the oil pan by the oil pump, which forces the oil throughout the engine's moving parts. An oil filter ensures that the lubricant remains as clean as possible. Some engines have an oil cooler to keep the oil temperature within specified limits. When the engine is running smoothly, you're ready to go. This is accomplished by the transmission similar to your land-loving friends who only know fast and stop. The marine motor only has 2 gears, forward and reverse. On almost all marine transmissions, you will find reduction gears such as these, which will allow the engine to power a larger and more efficient propeller. At first, you might think this is defeating the purpose by reducing revolutions. However, a large, slow-rotating propeller provides greater push than a small, fast-rotating propeller. To achieve this extra push, reduction gears are used. The propeller is mounted on a propeller shaft. The stuffing box allows the prop shaft to rotate freely through the hull of the boat, while at the same time preventing excess water from leaking into the bilge. Other boats are driven through a stern-driven transmission mounted externally. And that's it. You've just gone on a basic tour of the entire engine. Now let's take a look at some specific engine organs. If a person knows nothing about an engine, he knows he has a battery. The battery plays a vital role in the electrical system of your motor. Bluntly, if the battery or any of its wiring fails, the engine will not start on its own. The marine battery needs to be pampered. It's forced to live in a damp environment. It's used only sporadically and for short intervals. And most of the year, it sits out of use. When it is used, it's forced to power all sorts of accessories that the land battery has never dreamed about. One of the most important things to know about the battery is that the positive terminal must be connected to the positive battery cable. This cable is most often, but not always, colored red. The negative terminal, which is notated by a negative sign on the battery, must be connected to the negative battery cable, also called the ground cable. The other end of this ground cable is usually connected directly to the engine block. Do not reverse these connections. There are some very old engines that use a positive ground electrical system. Now, if you have one, you'll have to consult a professional marine technician regarding service. That's beyond the scope of this video. The battery provides the energy which is utilized by the ignition system. Let's talk a little bit about the ignition system and its relationship to the entire motor. The ignition system actually starts with the ignition switch. Most of the time it is located here in the cockpit. The purpose of the ignition switch is to connect the voltage coming from the battery to the ignition system voltage components. It does this through the low voltage wiring. The low voltage wiring carries the voltage to the ballast. The ballast serves as a buffer to prevent excessive current from reaching the ignition coil here. When it's cold, the ballast allows more current to pass, which gives the engine the extra power it needs to start. However, when the engine is started and the ballast warms from the current flow, it automatically reduces the amount of current delivered to the coil. This allows the engine to then run properly after igniting. On some motors, you may not be able to find the ballast. Sometimes the ballast is included inside the ignition coil, and we'll get to that in a moment. At other times, the ballast is replaced by a section of alloyed wire, also in the ignition coil. The ignition coil is actually a transformer. It has two major types of wiring wrapped around this iron core. This heavy insulated wire is the low voltage wiring. Most of the time it is referred to as the primary wiring. It is probably only wrapped a few dozen times. The primary wiring is the winding that carries the actual battery voltage. This other wiring is much thinner and is called the secondary wiring. It consists of thousands of turns of wire. What comes out of the secondary wiring is a very high voltage that causes a spark at the spark plugs. On the outside of the coil assembly, you see three electrical wires. This wire, which is coming from the coil tower, connects the high voltage of the secondary wiring to the distributor. This smaller wire brings current from the battery to the coil via the ignition switch and ballast. This other wire conducts low voltage power to the points inside the distributor. The distributor is the soul of the ignition process, and being the soul, sometimes it can produce some pretty inconvenient karma. As I mentioned before, what goes on in here determines which spark plug will receive electricity and at what time the spark will occur. This is accomplished by the points, condenser, rotor, and automatic advance, all of which are housed beneath the distributor cap. These are the points. One point is attached indirectly to the battery via the ignition's coil primary winding. The other point is grounded to the engine. The points are like a timing switch for the spark plugs. They receive low voltage from the ignition coil's primary wires. When the points are closed, nothing happens. The voltage from the battery runs freely to the ground. When the points are open, a spark plug fires. Your engine may be fitted with a breakerless electronic ignition. This kind of system is generally maintenance-free, meaning it either works or it doesn't. The only things to check and repair yourself are poor electrical connections and to keep everything clean. All the rest of the troubleshooting and maintenance in this video will deal with contact breaker type ignitions. Attached to the points is the condenser. Most of the time you will find it here, inside the distributor. The condenser is an odd bird. When the points are closed, it is inactive. However, when the points are open, the condenser accepts all the voltage going previously to the points and sends it back to the ignition coil. What happens is that the current begins to flow both ways. This builds up an electrical tension which strengthens the resulting spark. Spinning at half engine speed is the center vertical shaft. At the top of this shaft sits the rotor. The rotor has a metal contact on its side which is responsible for distributing current at just the right wires. At the bottom of the center vertical shaft is the automatic advance. It mainly consists of a set of weights that spin with the vertical shaft. When the engine is still, the weights hang closely to the shaft. However, as the engine begins to work and the vertical shaft begins to spin, the weights are thrown by centrifugal force away from the shaft. These springs create tension to hold them in place and to bring them back to their original position once the engine is idle again. When the engine is revved up and the weights are thrown away from the shaft, their angular position causes the mount on which the points sit to move forward. This causes the points to open sooner and thus the spark plugs to fire earlier. Mechanics refer to this as advancing the spark. We'll just call it keeping the engine running. If this didn't occur at higher speeds, the engine would run sluggishly because the spark plugs would no longer be in sync with the accelerated pace of the pistons. The distributor cap is more than a covering. Inside are metal contacts which are brushed by the revolving rotor. As soon as the rotor connects with the distributor contacts, a spark can then be sent through these, the spark plug wires. The spark plug wires carry high voltage, often over 12,000 volts, to the spark plugs. For those of you who don't know, that's enough to hurt. The spark plug itself is basically a porcelain molding with a heavy wire conductor inside. The spark plug wire attaches to this end. On the other end are two electrodes. This top electrode is connected to the center electrode. The spark travels through the center electrode and then jumps to this outer electrode in order to get to ground. It is at this jump that the combustible material in the cylinder is ignited, sending the piston down on its power stroke. Those are all the individual components of the ignition electrical system. Now that we have the juice, let's get this thing started. To get the engine going, most inboard motors have electric starters. The starter consists of a small electric motor and a set of gears. The starter is only going to be found on motors with an ignition switch. Obviously, if you have a manual pull-start engine, there is little use for the starter. In that case, you take along your resident Gorilla. For its size, the starter is a powerful little motor. It is designed for condensed, short-term use, usually for about 5 or 10 seconds. Extended periods of cranking will cause the starter to overheat. Running by itself, it rotates at approximately 5,000 RPMs. Under the strain of cranking the engine, however, it is reduced to 1,000 RPMs. Since your engine needs only about 300 RPMs to start, there is a reduction gear between the starter's armature, which is this coil of wires, and the motor itself. This is the armature. This small gear is the pinion which meshes with the flywheel that we discussed earlier. The pinion is attached to the armature by this spline shaft. This type of starter has an electromagnet called a solenoid, mounted on top of the starter itself. This spring helps to pop the pinion into place against the flywheel. This allows the pinion to spin and transmit torque, which is turning or spinning force, while at the same time allowing the pinion to move back and forth on the shaft. The solenoid has several purposes. In addition to moving the pinion forward, it also energizes the starter motor itself. In some models, it even energizes the ignition coils by bypassing the ballast. This gives the starter more initial cranking power. To make sure that the battery maintains the power it needs to start and operate the engine, it needs to be constantly charged. This is done by the alternator. Alternators come in a variety of different models. The best way to determine your particular type is to consult your owner's manual. With the alternator is the voltage regulator. Sometimes the voltage regulator is contained inside the alternator, so if you can't find it, don't be alarmed. Once again, the best thing to do is to consult your owner's manual. The voltage regulator determines how much voltage to send back to the battery for proper charging. The alternator is driven by a V-belt. Because the alternator is driven by the V-belt, it runs all the time. But that doesn't mean that it's charging all the time. It's like running in place. Whether or not the electrical system is receiving energy from the alternator is determined by the voltage regulator. Inside the alternator are rectifier diodes which change alternating current to direct current for battery charging. These diodes will draw energy regardless of whether the engine is running or not. To prevent this, there is an auxiliary switch between the alternator and the regulator. When the ignition switch is off, this auxiliary switch is also off, and the connection is broken. The alternator can't draw current from the battery. This is the reason that when the ignition switch is left on but the engine is not running, the battery will run down and die. For the mule to run, we need to feed her. Now let's see how she eats. Gasoline is stored in the fuel tank. The fuel tank has a vent which lets air into the tank as gasoline is used. From the fuel tank also runs a hose or a pipe. This is attached to a fuel line connected to the fuel filter. A fuel line runs from the other side of the fuel filter to a flexible hose which is attached to the engine. Now, most of the time, this is where you will find the fuel pump. The fuel pump's purpose is to transfer fuel from the fuel tank to the carburetor where it can be mixed with air. For safety, the entire system should be grounded to avoid potential fires from static electricity. And that's basically the entire engine system. Now that you know how the system works, we can get to our main point, and that's preventive maintenance. As Grandma used to say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Nowhere can that be more true than when you are a few miles out at sea and the engine dies and won't start. Since most problems occur in the ignition system, that's logically the first place to begin our routine maintenance. Let's start with the battery. First of all, you need to make sure that you have a battery with enough capacity to run your boat. Consult your owner's manual for the exact size. When buying a boat battery, buy one with the longest guarantee. Be sure it's designed for marine use and deal only with reputable, proven brand names. Nothing makes you want to kick yourself more than being stranded in the middle of nowhere because you wanted to save a few pennies. One way to ensure having enough battery power is to have two batteries, one for the motor itself and one for the accessories. A set of jumper cables should always be on your boat should one battery fail and you need the assistance of the other. Or you could install a two-position battery switch system. The battery should be enclosed in a box to keep it from moving about and to contain potential battery acid leakage. However, make sure it is well ventilated so the battery can breathe. The battery should also be as close to the engine as possible. Extended cable length reduces voltage and hampers the starter's performance. The battery cables should be flexible. They should be the correct wire size and in good repair. The battery posts and cable clamps should be free from all corrosion and dirt. Corrosion causes a bad electrical connection. Too much corrosion can make an otherwise excellent battery useless. When you are not using the boat, it's a good idea to disconnect the battery to prevent accidental leakage of electricity to accessories. You can achieve the same effect by installing a battery disconnect switch like this close to the battery on the positive cables. Either way, remember, if you're disconnecting the battery, always disconnect the positive terminal first. When you're connecting the battery, always connect the positive terminal last. It's a good idea to occasionally test the potency of your battery. For that purpose, a hydrometer is used. Simply take the cap of the cell, suck up some of the battery acid, and read. It's best to check the battery's charge when the temperature is around 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. If the temperature is lower, the charge will read high. If the temperature is high, the charge will read low. If the battery is dead, it won't read at all. This one's just right. But if it were low, the first thing I would do is to charge the battery back up and then pat myself on the back for having checked. Normally, I would have the battery professionally charged. Charging the battery yourself can be dangerous to you and to the life of your battery if you don't know what you're doing. Discharging the battery and not charging it again for any length of time can also cause permanent damage. When you take the battery to be charged, have the service person evaluate the battery to determine if it'll hold its charge. Sometimes after charging, the battery will be dead before you can get it back on the boat. In that case, it's time to buy a new battery. You can, of course, have a marine charger installed on your boat. These are designed to keep your battery at the correct state of charge when you're not using the boat. Do not use a non-marine charger, as this will damage your battery and possibly your boat. While we have the cap off, let's check the fluid level. This one's a bit low. Most manufacturers recommend distilled water. However, in a pinch, remember that any water is better than no water. Treated correctly, most batteries will give you a couple of years of dependable service. After I've examined the battery and its connectors, I usually disconnect the battery cables before I continue my inspection. By disconnecting the cables, I never have to worry about accidentally shocking myself by short-circuiting any terminals with my tools. To prevent corrosion in the ignition switch, I like to rub a little graphite on the ignition key and insert it several times. Things look fine here, so let's look behind the panel. Check all the wires leading to the ignition switch. Make sure that their installation is free of any damage and that the wires themselves are well secured. If any appears damaged, replace it. If it looks loose, secure it. Trace the wires from the ignition switch to the coil on the ballast connector. Check them. Check the ballast. Remember, your ballast may be built into the ignition coil, so if you can't find it, don't panic. Just follow the wiring. If you do have a ballast, look it over for corrosion. If you find any, replace it. I never try to clean them. Once corrosion starts, the thing will never work correctly again anyway. Whether or not you replace the ballast, make sure all the connections are tight. Go from the ballast to the ignition coil. Check all the connections and make sure the ignition coil is mounted securely. If it is loose, it can literally rattle itself to death. Pull out the high voltage wire and look for corrosion there. If you do not see corrosion, clean the terminal and connector inside the tower. A cotton swab and some lacquer thinner will help clean the tough spots. If it's really bad, roll up some emery cloth and clean out the hole. This one's pretty clean, so we'll just replace the high tension lead and wipe out the entire coil. It's not a bad idea to spray the exterior with a moisture repellent spray. This will keep corrosion and moisture from building up in the future. Follow the high voltage wire to the distributor cap. If the high voltage wire begins to fray or become brittle, you will need to replace it. Label the wires coming out of the distributor with masking tape or a marker and remove them. Label both the wires and the distributor. A 1, 2, 3 numbering system is sufficient. Label the spark plug sockets also. If you don't label them, you may not remember exactly where they go, and then your engine won't run. Clean the terminals on both ends of the spark plug wires. A clean cloth, some cotton swabs, and some lacquer thinner should be sufficient. If the wires look brittle or ratty, it's best to replace them. 3 seasons is usually the maximum for spark plug wires. Before I remove anything, I usually clean off the distributor's exterior with a paper towel or a clean cloth. Then I spray it with a moisture repellent spray. You can never overuse this stuff. Now let's take off the cap. Turn it over and look for any corrosion on the metal connectors. If you see any at all, buy a new distributor cap. A new cap only costs a few dollars. Compared to all the seating you'll certainly end up doing with the old cap, it's a good deal. If you don't see any corrosion, spray it with the moisture repellent spray. Wipe off the excess and set it aside. Take out the rotor. Look at its metal parts. If you see anything that looks corroded or burned, replace it. Otherwise, wipe it clean and set it aside. Now look at the points. With your finger or a thin tool, carefully separate them and inspect their contact points. They should be smooth. If they're jagged or burned, the best thing to do is replace them. Undo the retaining screw and nut like this. Remove the old set of points. Make sure you get the new set seated properly and that the mounting screw has been tightened, but not too tight. After we have replaced the points, we need to set the clearance. Manually turn over the engine a few degrees at a time. You can do this by using a hand crank, an exposed pulley, a V-belt, or a flywheel. Turn the engine until the points are as far apart as possible. Using a feeler gauge, which you can get at any auto parts store, set the clearance specified in your owner's manual. When you have the correct clearance, tighten the set screw. Rotate the engine a few more times. Now, test the clearance again. It shouldn't have changed. If it did, reset the clearance and rotate the motor again. Do this until the gap is consistent. Anytime you replace the points, it's a good idea to check the timing. You should be able to find the recommended ignition timing data in your engine owner's manual. Using that information, find the timing marks on the flywheel or the balancer wheel. The balancer wheel is the one here on the end. It's the one with the V-belt. The goal of timing the engine is to match the timing mark to the stationary timing point. To do this, we'll connect a tachometer to the coil leads like this. The tachometer will indicate the rotation speed of the engine. Then gently connect a powered timing light to the spark plug number 1 wire and to the ground, making sure we don't puncture the wire or boot. Now let's start the engine. If your boat's in the water, you're fine. However, if you're out of the water, be sure you supply the engine with a water source to prevent it from overheating and causing damage to the engine. Using the tachometer as a guide will idle the engine at 600 RPMs or less. Anything above 600 RPMs will cause the centrifugal advance to become engaged. The timing light should now let you see if the timing mark and the stationary timing pointer line up. This time it doesn't. We'll adjust it by rotating the distributor housing. Loosen the nut or machine screw holding the distributor clamp and slightly rotate the distributor in one direction. If the timing marks are off worse than they were before, rotate it in the other direction. When you're satisfied with the timing, tighten the screw and you're finished. Let's look at the spark plugs. Be sure to blow away any dirt around the plugs before removing them. We don't want any debris to fall into the cylinders. Carefully unscrew the plugs. A ratchet with a spark plug fitting like this makes the job a lot easier. When you get the spark plug out, take a look. If it looks fairly new, reset the gap with your feeler gauge and put it back in. However, if it looks like this one, you need to replace it. Any type of burning or deteriorating of the electrodes hampers the spark. Remember, all of these electrical parts are cheap to replace, especially when compared to getting stranded. When in doubt, replace it. There are things to remember when you are replacing the spark plugs. The first is to get the correct kind. If you're not sure what type your engine uses, consult your owner's manual or take out the old ones and see what's already there. The next thing is to always adjust the clearance. Find the spark plug clearance needed in your owner's manual. If you can't find your owner's manual or you're in doubt, an average clearance is about 28 thousandths, or .028. Using the feeler gauge, adjust the gap to the proper clearance by moving the outer electrode. Never try to move the inner electrode. The feeler gauge should pass smoothly through the gap with just a slight drag. As soon as the clearance is adjusted, make sure the washer is still on the plug and screw both back into the cylinder. If you have a torque wrench, use it. Check your owner's manual for the correct torque. Usually torque's about 25 pounds per foot. However, most of you probably don't have a torque wrench. In that case, tighten the spark plug only until it feels snug. Don't overdo it now. If you do, you could strip the threads and break the porcelain. If that happens, you'll have to have the spark plug professionally removed. Once the spark plugs are back in the cylinder, attach the spark plug wires to the distributor and the spark plugs. Be sure to follow the numbering system you made earlier. If you are replacing the wires, match up the correct wires by length. Take the old wire numbered 1 and find the new wire that matches that length. The new wire is then your new number 1 wire. The next step in our tune-up process is to change the fuel filters. That's if you're fitted with them, and adjust the carburetor. Changing the fuel filters is really quite simple. Just remember, no smoking. Most modern gasoline filters are of these types, an inline filter or an element type. On the inline or canister type, it's a simple matter to unscrew and replace it. Use a tubing wrench or an oil filter wrench and do not over-tighten. On an element type, unscrew the mounting bolt and gently remove the element from its housing. Clean out any sludge or contaminants from the housing and install a new filter element. Run the engine and check for leaks. Basically, a carburetor is a metering device which mixes the proper amount of fuel and air for delivery to the cylinders under all operating conditions. The first thing to consider before making idle speed and mixture adjustments is to verify that the ignition system and compression are satisfactory. First, remove dirt, gum, and varnish from all parts of the carburetor, taking care not to use solvents on rubber or plastic parts, as they will be damaged. Second, inspect all the parts for signs of corrosion, cracking, or wear, and replace them if necessary. Third, check all throttle levers or valves for binding or other damage. And fourth, check all filters for dirt or clogging and replace them as necessary. Now, make sure that the flame arrestor is installed and that you have water circulating through the engine if your boat is out of the water. Start the engine and allow it to reach normal operating temperature. Be sure that the choke is fully open. Disconnect the throttle cable from the engine. Adjust the idle speed screw to obtain the idle speed specified in your owner's manual. Then adjust the idle mixture screws until the RPM is steady and the engine sounds like it's running smooth. If the engine starts to die when you turn the mixture screw in, then back them off a little bit until it smooths out. If you turn the screws out too much, the engine will begin to hunt, so don't overcompensate. Next, readjust the idle speed screws to obtain the specified RPM. And finally, reconnect and readjust the throttle cable. Now your engine is nice and warm. It's a good time to change the oil and the oil filter. This should be done at least once a season, more often if you use your boat a lot. It's not difficult to do, and it's probably the single most important thing you can do to lengthen the life of your engine. Dirty oil contains acids, sludges, and contaminants that can really mess up the bearing surfaces inside your motor, so don't ever neglect this task. As I said before, change the oil when the engine is warmed up. Some engines are mounted so all you have to do is put a suitable container under the plug in the oil pan. Unscrew the plug and let the oil drain. Other drain plugs are more inaccessible, so you have to drain the oil out using a pump through the dipstick tube. Here you can see a hand pump being used. You can use a little electric pump or even a drill pump mounted on your electric drill. The oil filter is usually mounted on the side of the block. Use a rag and you won't spill much oil, if any. As most modern filters are a screw-on canister type, just unscrew the filter using this filter wrench and holding it up like this. Take the new oil filter, smear the rubber sealing ring with clean oil, and screw it on tight. Take the wrench and screw it 1/4 turn more. Make sure you have put the drain plug back, if you've removed it. Oh, by the way, some drain plugs have a magnet in the end to catch metal particles from inside the engine. Just wipe the end of the plug clean before you reinstall it. Tighten it, making sure that the mating surfaces are clean. If you have drained the oil through the dipstick tube, just wipe the stick and put it back in. Make sure you have the right grade of oil for your engine. Most marine gasoline engines use a straight 30-weight oil. Use a reputable brand. Remove the oil fill cap and fill the engine with the recommended quantity, up to the full mark. Then add 1/2 quart for the oil filter. Replace the fill cap and start the engine. Do not race it. Idle it so that the oil can fill the oil filter and build up pressure. Check for leaks. If there are any, stop the engine and fix them. Be careful, though, disposing of the old oil. Perhaps the easiest way is to put it in a sealed container and take it to your local gas station, where they'll probably be able to take your waste oil and mix it with theirs. Please do not dump it in your garbage or down the drain. Use the same procedure to change your transmission oil. You must replace it with the same type, and most of them do not use engine oil. Check your manual. Every few weeks, check your engine belts. Check the tension of the belts. The tension can be adjusted by this bolt. Simply loosen the bolt like this, apply pressure to the wheel, and then tighten the bolt. Should the belt need to be replaced, you do it the same way. Check the belt for wear. If it looks cracked or slightly frayed, replace it. Always carry extra belts with you when you are planning a trip, because no matter how good they look at the dock, they're bound to break. Check your hoses and clamps. Some carry water, others gasoline, and others oil. Squeeze them. If they feel mushy or too soft, replace them. If, on the other hand, they are very hard and feel brittle, also change them. Your marine store will be able to give you the right type of hose if you tell them what it's for. Often you'll want to bring in a piece of old hose so that you can get the right size. If any hoses are chafing, it will only be a short time until you have a leak, a fire, or a seized engine. Install a longer hose. Use wire ties on an old piece of hose cut lengthwise as a chafe guard, or reroute the existing hose so it doesn't rub anywhere. Hose clamps should be marine grade with a stainless band and screw. One way to check is to use a magnet. Stainless steel clamps are non-magnetic. Replace any other kind. Below the waterline, use 2 clamps. If one fails, then at least your boat won't sink. Always tighten, but don't over-tighten. The best tool to use is a nut driver that fits over the hex screw. Check your control cables. Usually they cannot be lubricated, but you can check the mounting brackets and clevis pins at both ends. If you're not planning on using your boat for any period of time, I would suggest doing one of two things. Either fill the fuel tank completely to the top or take all the fuel completely out of the tank. Gasoline that is allowed to sit for any period of time begins to deteriorate. When this happens, it causes tar and gum to build up in your engine. By taking all the gas out, you eliminate the problem. By filling the tank to the top, you eliminate the air needed to oxidize the gas to produce the tar. Either way, you will help prevent fuel line blockage. Now, if you really feel adventurous, check the electrical connections on the other engine parts. Check the solenoid, the regulator, and the alternator. Go throughout the entire engine once a year. Once a year should be sufficient for this type of investigation. Most boat owners suggest doing this either at the end of the season or the start of a new one. If your engine is raw water cooled and runs in salt water, it's best to flush it with fresh water after every use. You can either use this if your boat is equipped with an outdrive, or install a garden hose adapter just in front of your seawater intake. That way, when you come back to the dock or the launching area, it's a simple matter to flush out salt water in the engine. If your engine has a contained cooling system, always make sure that you have plenty of water and antifreeze coolant. You should always carry a spare impeller. This is what is inside your raw water pump. It should be checked once a season and replaced. Check the blades of the impeller for cracks or scrape marks. If you see any, replace it. Make sure you always carry a new gasket. Removal and replacement is quite easy. First, turn off your through hull. On most pumps, there are 4 or 5 screws holding a cover plate onto the pump body. Remove the plate and the impeller is inside, as you can see. Some of the blades are squashed against a cam. That's how the water is carried through the pump. Most times the impeller is held onto the pump shaft with a keyway or a flat or a slot. Gently lever the impeller out with a flat-bladed screwdriver. Be careful not to mark the pump body. Sometimes you can use a pair of needle-nose pliers to pull the impeller out. Install the new impeller in reverse. Put a little bit of Vaseline on the blades and push it into place. Reinstall the cover plate using a new gasket, and don't forget to open the through hull. Some cooling systems contain zinc anodes to help prevent corrosion. These are usually screwed into the heat exchanger. Every 3 months, check them. Turn off the seawater intake valve. Unscrew the anode plug and see if it is still okay. If it's worn, screw in a new one. Reinstall the anode plug and reopen the seawater intake. Short runs are not good for the engine. One of the best things that you can do to keep your engine running smoothly is to let the motor warm up completely before you turn it off. When you turn off the engine prior to letting it warm up, condensation builds up inside the engine. This condensation causes the engine to rust. Repeated over and over, this can cause serious and irreparable problems to your engine. The exhaust system on your gas engine is quite simple. As you can see here, the gases come down out of the manifolds and are mixed without water in the down riser. There's really not much maintenance to do, except take care of leaks and keep the system clean and tight. Regularly check the hoses and clamps. In fact, it's a good idea to double clamp all the hoses on the system in case a clamp breaks. A leak can flood your boat with water and, more importantly, with exhaust gases which contain carbon monoxide, which is colorless, odorless, and deadly. So keep that exhaust system tight. After a couple of years of use, you may notice your engine running a little hotter. If you checked out the rest of the cooling system and everything seems to be okay, then the chances are that it's time to have your risers cleaned out. As you can see from the riser, this passage that the raw water passes through isn't very big. Over a period of time, it will scale up from the elements in the water passing through it and gradually allow less and less water to pass through it. Thus, your engine temperature will rise. There are 2 cures. The first one is replacement. The second is to take off the manifold and the risers and have them bored out in a radiator shop. Just like the heat exchanger, removal is fairly simple. All you need is a screwdriver, the correct size wrenches, and strong arms. Unbolt the manifold bolts indicated here and undo the exhaust hose clamps. Slide off the exhaust hose and pull off the manifold and riser's assembly in one piece. You can then disassemble it by taking off the nuts and bolts that keep it together, like this. When it's all nice and clean, or if it's a new one shiny out of the box, reassemble with the new gaskets. Don't forget to put a gasket sealer on the gaskets, except for the manifold gaskets, which are a special type and don't need sealant. Tighten everything home, including the hose clamps. Oh, and by the way, don't forget to check your exhaust hoses. Now that we have the engine well maintained, nothing can go wrong. If we could only be that lucky. But no matter how careful we are to keep the engine running smoothly, something is bound to foul up. Parts do get old and connections break, wires get brittle, and being constantly tossed and subjected to the sprays of water, it's a wonder the mechanical breeze runs at all. Most of the problems that will occur will be directly related to the electrical system. That's mainly because electricity and water don't mix. Since the electrical system begins with the battery, let's start there. Sometimes you'll have a battery that has performed well in the past and for some reason now won't hold a charge. The first thing I do is to take the battery out, have it recharged and evaluated. A defective battery will lose its charge regardless of whether it's connected or not. If you have a bad battery, the only thing you can do is buy a new one. Don't try to squeeze the last bit of life out of it, because you're going to get stuck. But what if you have the battery charged and evaluated and it still loses power after it's installed? The problem could be that there is an electrical leak somewhere in the boat. The larger the leak, the faster the battery will be drained. But no matter how small the leak is, it needs to be found and repaired. At first, this may sound like the old needle in the haystack proverb, but it's really not that complicated. You can start up the engine on a dark night and watch it. Look for any sparks. Most of the time you won't see any, but if you do, that means there is an electrical leak. By locating the leak at night, you can isolate the leak and repair it. There are devices for testing electrical leaks, but you can make one yourself rather inexpensively. All you need are two pieces of wire, a 12-volt light bulb and a corresponding light socket. Take the positive terminal off the battery. Connect one of the wires to the positive terminal. Turn off all the individual circuit breakers on your boat, or if your boat uses fuses, take them out. Connect the other wire to the battery clamp. The light should not glow at all, but if it does, you've forgotten to disconnect something. Assuming that the light is dark, close each circuit breaker or replace each fuse individually. When the light comes on, you know you found your leak. Now, it's just a simple matter of tracing the electrical system of that particular circuit. But if that's not the problem, it could be that the alternator or regulator is not charging the battery. The first thing I do is check the tension of the V-belt. If the V-belt is loose, a simple adjustment should do the trick. However, this belt is tight. Since that's not the problem, let's check all the connections between the alternator, regulator, battery, and ignition. Saying that we find no problem there, we may have a faulty alternator or regulator. I can narrow down the culprit by connecting a wire from the battery's positive post and the alternator's field terminal with the engine running. If the alternator begins charging like crazy, you will hear the load on your engine. Then you know it's your regulator. If there is no change, it's probably the alternator. However, check your owner's manual before you attempt this procedure. It may not be possible with your alternator. You must identify the field terminal correctly. Some boat owners seem to buy more batteries than others. There could be several reasons for this. If you're one of those boat owners, you might want to make sure that the battery is properly installed and firmly secured. When the battery is allowed to be tossed and bounced around, its life expectancy is greatly reduced. It could also be that you have a too small of a size battery for your size engine and accessories. Your owner's manual should give you the exact size needed. Other problems could be too many minerals in the replacement water you use, or just an inferior brand of battery to begin with. When I see a battery with cells that use an excessive amount of water, it usually tells me one of three things. The first is that the charge rate is too high. Now this can be solved by reducing the charging rate on the voltage regulator by about 1/2 volt. Some regulators are non-adjustable. You may have to buy a lower output regulator. Another problem could be that the battery compartment is too hot and that there's not enough ventilation. In that case, the best thing to do is to shield the battery from any kind of heat source, such as exhaust pipes or engine manifolds. You should also install a vent or a blower. The third problem could be that the voltage regulator is defective and needs to be replaced. To determine if it is the regulator, use the method I just described. If you turn the key and nothing happens, the first thing to do is to make sure your transmission is in neutral. Almost all engines will refuse to start if they are in gear. If that's not the problem, the battery may be dead. Look at the voltmeter on your panel. Connect your 12-volt test light you made earlier to the 2 battery posts. If the light doesn't come on, the battery is dead. If it comes on, try starting the engine. It should stay on. However, if it fades, that means your battery is dying. For the present, you can jump or connect the battery to your accessory battery. Later, have the battery recharged and evaluated. If your light test shows that the battery seems to be fine, then disconnect the battery cables and clean the posts and clamps. Also check the cable terminations at the starter. If the cantankerous machine still won't crank, the problem may be your manual starter switch circuit. Check all the connections between the starter switch, the solenoid, and the starter. If the battery is bad but not dead, the starter will crank slowly. The solenoid may just clank and chatter instead of cranking at all. All of this can be a result of a bad battery or battery connection. If the engine won't start but just clicks when you press the starter, it probably means you have a bad solenoid switch. To test it, use your 12-volt light. Put one wire on the ground terminal and the other wire on the terminal leading to the starter motor. When the starter switch is pressed, the light should come on. If it doesn't, it's the solenoid. Sometimes the engine cranks but the motor won't start. The first thing I would check is to make sure the ignition is actually turned on. It is, so that's not the problem. My first concern is if the spark plugs are firing. To find out, disconnect one of the spark plug wires. Hold the metal connector next to, but not touching the engine, and try the starter again. If there's a spark, you've isolated your problem. Just be sure when you try the starter switch that you aren't holding the metal part of the spark plug wire. If you do, you're literally in for a shock. Having seen fire, we know that the problem may be in the plugs. By taking one out, we can help diagnose the problem. If the plug is wet, it probably means the engine is flooded. If it's dry, it could mean that the plugs are not receiving fuel. Let's assume they're wet and the engine is flooded. You should be able to smell the gasoline on the plugs. Put all the plugs back in and connect them. Open up the throttle and crank the engine. What you're trying to do is to dry out the cylinders and plugs. After 10 seconds, crank the engine again at normal throttle setting. If it still won't fire, number the spark plug wires and cylinders and take out all the spark plugs. You're going to have to dry them out manually. Rubbing them down with a dry, clean cloth should do the trick. If not, you can use a lighter, match, or even heat them in the stove. Once you've dried them out, put the spark plugs back in place. Replace the spark plug wires following your numbering system. The engine should fire. If not, the choke may be your problem. If you are using a manual choke, lay off of it. If you have an automatic choke, make sure it isn't stuck. You can do this by first removing the flame arrestor, which will expose the carburetor. Check the choke for free movement. Do not crank the engine with the arrestor removed. You could be burned if the engine backfires. You can usually hold the choke open using the external choke lever on the carburetor. Reinstall the flame arrestor and holding the choke open, crank the engine with the throttle open also. After a few seconds, close the throttle and still holding the choke, crank again. The engine should fire. Let's assume that the plugs were dry. The problem could be in your fuel line. Blocked fuel lines are a common cause of engine failure. Before you do anything with the fuel lines, make sure that all open flames or cigarettes are extinguished and the blower is on. First of all, make sure that you have gas. Don't laugh, it does happen. If you do have gas, then make sure all the valves in the fuel tank and line are open. Check the vent line at the gas tank. Sometimes the hose kinks or collapses or the vent blocks. Make sure it's clear, as you'll never be able to get anything out of the tank unless it is vented. Everything seems to be fine up to this point, so let's carefully disconnect the fuel line at the fuel pump. By blowing back into the fuel line, we'll be able to clear any obstacles which might prevent fuel flow. If the fuel line is clear, you can hear bubbles gurgling in the fuel tank. If you simply can't blow through the line, you know there is a major block. Find it or replace the line. If the fuel line seems to be fine, then proceed to the fuel filter. If you find any dirt, change it. If this doesn't solve your problems, you may need to replace the fuel pump. Here's how to check it. Disconnect the line coming out of the fuel pump, and using the same type of fitting connected to a piece of fuel hose, screw it in place and put the hose in a suitable container. Crank the engine. Fuel should flow from the hose. If it doesn't, then you have a faulty fuel pump. Sometimes when the engine gets very hot, the fuel system may develop a vapor lock. Most of the time, this happens on a hot day when you stop the engine and then try to start it back up again. Sometimes it will start and then quit. The best thing to do is to cool the fuel pump and gas lines with cold, wet rags. The vapor then should condense and the engine should start. There are 3 reasons why you would take a wrench and a screwdriver in hand and lay your carburetor open, from the choke plate to the idle screw. You're curious, you're a racer or a super enthusiast, or you've got a problem with your Crafts power plant and you want to fix it. If you're in the 3rd group, here are some troubleshooting tips to help you get going. But remember, safety first, so make sure that the engine is off and that there are no open flames or lit cigarettes in the area. Is there fuel in the carburetor? Remove the flame arrestor and look down into the throat. Open and close the throttle several times to make sure that fuel is squirting out of the pump jets. If no fuel is present, then the trouble is in the fuel system. Consider whether the fuel is fresh or several months old. This will cause the engine to run poorly. Many fuels tend to sour with age. In no case should you use fuel over a year old. If it's old fuel, drain your tank and replace it with fresh fuel. Don't forget, change your fuel filter. Binding or sticky choke plate or linkage. Use a commercial solvent or penetrating oil to remedy this problem. Intake leaks? Be sure that your rubber hoses are not split, leaking, or disconnected, and that the mounting bolts and gaskets are secure. Incorrect carburetor fuel level? Some carburetors have externally adjustable fuel levels, and others require disassembly for float adjustment. Carburetor icing. While the engine is warming up during high humidity and temperatures between 30 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, ice actually forms between the throttle plate and bore. Check the carburetor air preheat system and increase your idle speed slightly to help minimize this problem. Idle mixture adjustment. Turn the idle mixture screw in until the engine speed drops slightly. Then back the screw out about 1/8 of a turn. This is the lean best idle setting. Sometimes the engine will sound like it's dying at speed and will start to smoke. Remove your air cleaner. It can be restricted or dirty. Most times the element can be cleaned with kerosene and dried with pressurized air. If not, replace it with a new element. A clogged PCV valve? These can be cleaned with a little kerosene or solvent. Replace it if it will not clear. A clogged fuel filter? Don't hesitate to change it if you think it's the problem. Flooding. This is caused by fuel spilling out of the carburetor into the intake manifold due to a faulty float or inlet valve. Sometimes this is caused by rust or dirt from the fuel tank or in impure gasoline which holds the inlet valve off of its seat. This is dangerous. You must deal with the problem immediately before the leaking gasoline can catch fire or explode. Call your mechanic or take the boat to your dealer now. If you are familiar with carburetor repair, remove the top cover. remove the float, and replace the needle valve and seat, and the fuel float. The instructions that come with the rebuild kit will give you the float settings. If you saw a spark between the plug and the engine when you tested it, but the spark seemed weak, it usually means that the condenser has gone bad. An extra one of these is always good to keep on board. If there is no spark at all, then something else must be at fault. Reconnect all the spark plug wires. We know the problem's not there. Go to the distributor and disconnect the high voltage wire coming from the ignition coil. It's the one in the middle. Making sure your ignition is still on, hold the metal end of the wire about 1/4 of an inch from the engine. Crank the starter. If you see sparks, you now have something to work with. The sparks mean that the ignition coil is sending voltage, but it's not making it to the plugs. The fault could be in the distributor or the spark plug wires themselves. Take the distributor cap off and clean it out. Pop off the rotor and wipe its metal connector. Spray everything with a moisture-resistant spray, being sure to wipe off the excess. Replace everything. Check the spark plug wires to make sure they're okay. Put everything back together and try starting the engine once again. This time, if it doesn't start, you probably need to replace the rotor, cap, and wires. It's always a good idea to carry an extra set of these on board with you, too. If there were no sparks from the high voltage wire, the problem is either defective points, an open ballast connector, or ignition switch, or a broken wire in the primary circuit of the ignition coil. To examine the breaker points, open the distributor. Remove the rotor and gently pry open the points, as I described before. If they look worn, then you've probably found your problem. One way to check them is to turn on the ignition and crank the engine. You should be able to see a small spark fly across the points as they open. These look fine, so I'd probably check the connections from the battery to the ignition, to the ballast, and then the ignition coil. What I'm looking for are any loose wires or corrosion. Now, if anything looks awry, I'm going to tighten it, fix it, or replace it. Now, if I still find nothing wrong, I'll check the ignition switch with a meter. If it's no good, you can jump the wires temporarily until you can get a new one. If the engine still won't start, it may be a defective condenser or ignition coil. The best way to determine if that is the problem is to substitute a new condenser or coil. It's not a bad idea to have an extra set of these on board with you all the time. If the engine starts but immediately dies when you release the starter, then the problem is probably in your ballast or the connections to your ignition coil. As you recall, when you start your engine, the engine needs extra power. To supply that power, the starter switch bypasses the ballast. When you release the starter switch, the energy then flows through the ballast like normal. If the ballast is bad, the engine will die. There are two ways to see if it is your ballast. The first is to simply replace it. As I've said before, it never hurts to carry an extra ballast with you. Other than replacing it, you can connect your 12-volt connector that you made earlier from the positive pole of the battery to the bat terminal of the ignition coil. If the light glows when you try to crank the motor but goes out when the starter is released, you've found your problem. We've repaired the engine and now it fires. However, suddenly it begins to knock and run rough at fast speeds. Usually that means that the spark timing is advanced too far. Reset the timing as we discussed before. Also, make sure you use the correct gas for your motor. Simple as it sounds, sometimes that will solve your problem. If the engine runs rough at low speeds, this could be the result of dirty plugs, wet high voltage wires, a damp distributor, bad points, or even an overly advanced ignition. Solve these problems as I've mentioned before. If the engine sounds and runs rough at all speeds, this could be the result of bad points, wet or corroded wiring, bad timing, or burned spark plugs. If the clang is rhythmic, it may be a cylinder that's bad. To determine if that's the problem, use a well-insulated screwdriver and short-circuit each spark plug like this. If you short-circuit a good cylinder, the engine will sound worse. If you short-circuit a bad cylinder, you can't tell a difference. If it's a bad cylinder, you'll probably need to take it to a mechanic. If your engine starts fine, runs fine, but then falls apart when you request some speed, the first thing to check is your fuel supply. If that's fine, then check your timing. If you still find no problem, your points may be bad or the clearance may be incorrect. You may also have a defective coil if the engine won't go over 2,000 RPM in gear. Backfiring is sometimes a problem. The first thing to do is to check your plugs. Look for cracks as well as burned electrodes. If they seem fine, that may mean your timing needs to be advanced. If that doesn't stop the problem, check the fuel lines. If there are no obstructions, you may have a stuck valve. If that's the case, a mechanic will need to take a look. If you're going along fine and then suddenly the engine dies, the first thing to do is to make sure you haven't turned off the motor. Don't laugh. It's these simple things that will get you. If that's not the problem, try the horn to make sure you're still getting auxiliary power. If the horn works, that means the battery is fine. The next thing is to make sure you have fuel. If these things aren't the problem, check the fuel line as I've mentioned before. If the fuel line is clear, check the connections and the equipment from the spark plugs to the battery. Somewhere in there should be your problem. Just make sure that your engine is not overheating. That will cause it to stop. If you're not careful, you can seize up an overheating motor. Turn it off immediately and look for the problem in the cooling system. Usually it's a broken belt or a water intake blocked by a plastic bag or seaweed. Sometimes it's a ruptured hose. Although you probably would have smelled it or seen steam coming up from your engine space. If you can fix it, wait for the engine to cool down before making repairs. Always carry a spare belt and some hose on board. Another cause of overheating is a stuck thermostat. The thermostat regulates the flow of water through the engine, and if it does not open all the way, it will restrict the flow and cause overheating. If you cannot find a leak, the belts and hoses are okay. And if you have no obvious problem with the water pump, either recirculating or impeller type, the chances are that your thermostat needs to be replaced. The thermostat can be located anywhere on the engine. On this engine, it is here. Changing a thermostat itself is relatively simple once you have located it. Simply remove the housing cover, which is usually bolted on, remove the old thermostat and place the new one in. Of course, oftentimes the bolts are seized. The thermostat is corroded in its housing and the housing cover won't come off or breaks when you remove it. Refer to your owner's manual for the correct procedure when replacing this often neglected item. Don't be afraid to do it. As you can see on this engine, it was a piece of cake. If you have a coolant leak, you'll probably notice it easily. Coolant is usually green and a small leak at a hose clamp or a gasket will be noticeable. If you're losing coolant and cannot find the leak, then it is usually one of two things: a leak in your heat exchanger or an internal engine leak. Sometimes you can find a heat exchanger leak by looking at the exhaust water. If you see green in it, then that's where your coolant is going. Take off the heat exchanger by unbolting it and removing the hoses. Then take it to your local radiator shop where they can pressure check it for leaks and see if the tubes are plugged, which is also a common cause of engine temperature creep. Sometimes they can solder it up and repair it, fix it right away, or replace it. Another way of finding a heat exchanger leak is to take off the header cap when the engine is warmed up but not hot. Be very careful not to get scalded when you do this. Look inside the header tank and see if the coolant water is bubbling a lot. If it is, then your leak is probably not in the heat exchanger, but in the cylinder head gasket or in the cylinder head. If it's not bubbling, then there's probably a hole in the heat exchanger. A cylinder head or gasket leak will often evidence itself in hard starting or white smoke as the water turns into steam when running. The cure is to pull the cylinder head and gasket and make the appropriate repairs, a job you'll probably want to leave to your mechanic. If everything is fine as you're cruising along and then suddenly when you accelerate you hear a screeching noise, the most common problem is that your V-belt has become loose or deteriorated on your alternator. Check it immediately and either tighten up the belt or replace it, whichever is needed. If the engine revs suddenly, check if you still have a propeller. You may have hit something and broken a hub or a shear pin, and the propeller may have fallen off. Remember to always disconnect the spark plug wires before working with the propeller. If no matter what speed you are going, you hear a constant growling from the area of the alternator, you probably have a defective ball bearing on the pulley end of the alternator shaft. The best thing to do is to have it replaced. Unless you live in a climate that stays warm year-round, you'll probably want to put your boat into storage during the wintertime. One of the worst things that you can do to an engine is not run it. When it just sits there, the engine deteriorates more than in several seasons of use. Remember the old adage, use it or lose it. There are several things you can do to help keep your engine healthy during the off-season. Engine oil builds up acids and moisture while it lubricates the engine. Left standing, these impurities begin to eat away at the guts of the engine. To combat that, simply change the oil and filter before you put it to rest. To keep the fuel from getting old, either fill the tank completely or empty it altogether. I like to empty the tank because it makes the boat lighter when I store it in the dry dock. For closed cooling system engines, to prevent freezing, drain the cooling system, or better yet, use a good quality antifreeze, mixed thoroughly with the cooling water. About a 50-50 ratio is okay. Let the engine run a little bit to make sure the antifreeze is distributed properly. For extra protection, spray moisture inhibitor behind the instrument panel and on all the electrical connections. Take out all the spark plugs and squirt about an ounce or so of clean engine oil into each spark plug hole. Next, disconnect the high tension wire coming from the ignition coil. You can do this by pulling the wire from the coil housing and holding it against the metal part of the engine. With the high voltage wire grounded, crank the engine a few times with the starter. This will protect the engine against rust by distributing oil throughout the cylinders. Then put the high voltage wire and spark plugs back. Be sure to label the spark plug wires so that you can reinstall them properly. As we showed you how before, take the tension off of the V-belts. This will save the belts and bearings from developing flat spots by being left in the same place for too long. When I'm completely finished, I disconnect the batteries and take them home. By doing this, I can monitor their charge all winter. You know, it may seem like extra work, but it sure beats buying a new battery in the spring. The last thing is to cover the engine with a tarp that will keep water out, but will still let the engine breathe. The winter is a great time to get your prop repaired. In the spring, when everybody else is taking theirs into the shop, you'll already be out on the water. Of course, there are some things that you'll want to do to recommission your engine before you go. The first thing to do is to check all your electrical connections. Examine all the pipes, hoses, clamps, belts, and cables, and make sure that they're all in good condition. It's never a bad idea to go through the process we mentioned in the maintenance section of this tape. Replace the fuel filter, spark plugs, distributor cap, and rotor. Your engine will appreciate any extra attention you can give it. These are the most common problems any boat owner should expect to encounter. And with the maintenance techniques learned here, you should be able to prevent most of them from happening to you. Use your owner's manual. It's an indispensable guide in really getting to know your engine. The inboard motor is a great machine. Hopefully, we've taken the mystery out of it and made it a little bit more approachable. By keeping it healthy, you can concentrate on the whole reason you have a yacht, to have fun.